When my house burned down in the middle of a winter night, I stood outside in the snow and called my son. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "It's none of my business. You should have been more careful." The next day, the investigator called me in and asked, "Did anyone enter your house last week?" I froze, because only one person had, what they found in the ashes. At that moment, I understood. There were things that should never have been in that house. I'm so grateful you're here. To help us connect, please comment below with your city or country. Note: while this story contains fictional elements for entertainment and education, and any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, the core message remains a vital lesson for you. The winter in Hartford has a way of biting through the glass, a persistent chill that reminds you you're no longer the master of your own warmth. I sit here now in this cramped spare room at Leo's place, staring at the frost creeping across the pane. It's a quiet life, or what's left of one. People see an old man in borrowed flannel, and they think tragedy. They aren't wrong. Let me tell you how I almost died in my own home. And more importantly, let me tell you about the person who put me there. Before the soot and the melted plastic, there was the scent of white pine. My home on Prospect Avenue wasn't just a structure of wood and nails. It was a sanctuary. I had a small woodworking shop in the garage where the air was always thick with sawdust and the ghost of cedar. On the mantel sat the portrait of Margaret, my late wife, her smile frozen in 1994, watching over a living room that felt like a well-worn glove. We had paid off the mortgage 20 years ago. Margaret and I made sure of that. I used to tell the neighbors with a sliver of pride. It was ours. Every floorboard, every shingle, every memory. In the United States, owning your land outright is the ultimate peace of mind. Or so I thought. On the night of January 11th, 2025, the world outside was hushed by a light dusting of Connecticut snow. I was 72, and my body had its rituals. Around 11 p.m., I felt the familiar heaviness in my eyelids while sitting in my wingback chair. Following a decade-long habit, I reached up, plucked the hearing aids from my ears, and set them on the nightstand. To a man who spent 40 years around table saws, silence isn't an absence, it's a relief. I didn't notice the small red light on the device blinking a tired rhythmic amber, signaling a critically low battery. I just closed my eyes and let the darkness take me. In the living room, perched on a side table, Julian had helped me clear. Just a week prior sat a sleek modern speaker. It was a gift from my son. It looked out of place among my antique carvings, a black obsidian slab in a room of oak. At 11:47 p.m. the silence broke, though I couldn't hear it. A soft pop echoed from the speaker's base. Not a loud explosion, but a chemical hiss. A thin ribbon of acrid black smoke began to curl toward the ceiling. In the basement, the smoke detector began its shrill 85 decibel scream, a sound designed to wake the dead. But I wasn't dead yet. I was just deaf. The fire moved with a terrifying, calculated hunger. It didn't start with a roar. It began with a crawl. The curtains, heavy and velvet, caught first. Then, the drywall. By the time the heat reached my bedroom door, the oxygen in the hallway was being consumed by an orange beast. I woke up not to a sound, but to the taste of ash. My lungs felt like they were being scrubbed with sandpaper. I sat up, gasping, my eyes stinging as a thick gray veil filled the room. Panic is a cold thing that settles in your gut. I lunged for the nightstand, my fingers trembling as I grabbed my hearing aid. I shoved it into my ear, desperate for the world to turn on, for the device to amplify the reality of my survival. Nothing. The battery was too weak. The internal circuitry groaned for a second, a distorted crackle, and then died completely. I was trapped in a silent inferno. I stumbled toward the door, but the heat was a physical wall pushing me back. Across the street, Leo was just pulling his delivery truck into his driveway. He's a younger man, works the late shifts for a logistics firm, always humming some tune I don't recognize. He told me later that he looked up and saw my first floor window glowing with a light that didn't belong to a lamp. It was the flickering rhythmic pulse of a disaster. Leo didn't call 911 first. He ran. I remember the door splintering. I remember a pair of strong arms grabbing my shoulders just as I was about to collapse from the fumes. Leo didn't say a word, or if he did, I couldn't hear him. He threw a heavy coat over my head and dragged me through the black throat of my own hallway. When the cold air hit my face, it felt like needles. We stood on the sidewalk, the snow melting under our bare feet, as the fire department sirens finally began to wail in the distance. I watched leaning heavily on Leo's shoulder as 30 years of my life turned into a column of heat. The fire was most beautiful where it was most destructive. I saw it break through the bedroom window. Through the glass, I saw the dresser ignite. I saw the silver-plated frame holding our wedding photo, the one Margaret had cherished, begin to warp. The plastic backing bubbled, the silver turned black, and the image of us standing outside the church in 1973 curled into a charred flake and vanished. Everything I owned, everything I had built with these hands was gone. I was a man of 72, standing in his pajamas on a Hartford sidewalk, possessing nothing but the air in my lungs and a dead piece of plastic in my ear. My hands shook as I reached into the pocket of the coat Leo had wrapped around me. My phone was there, the one thing I had grabbed instinctively from the charger. I needed my blood. I needed the one person who would fix this. My son would know what to do, I whispered into the freezing wind, my voice cracking. He would come. I dialed Julian's number. I pressed the phone so hard against my ear that it hurt, staring at the embers of my home. Ring, ring, ring. The sound was hollow, a rhythmic electronic ghost in the night. I waited for his voice, for the "Dad, I'm on my way" that would make the world stop burning. The line just kept ringing, stretching out into the cold, dark silence of the Connecticut night unanswered. The phone rang 6 times before he picked up. 6 rings, I counted every single one, while standing barefoot in the slush of a Connecticut January. Each tone was a hollow pulse in my ear, competing with the roar of the pumper trucks and the chaotic shouts of the firemen as they wrestled with the black hoses. The heat from the house was a dying beast now, casting long, flickering shadows of the skeletal white pine trees onto the snow. I was still in my thin cotton pajamas, the fabric clinging to my skin from the dampness of the melting frost. My toes had long since gone numb, but I didn't care. I just needed to hear his voice. And hello? The voice was thick with sleep, but underlined with an immediate sharp edge of irritation. It wasn't the voice of a son worried about a midnight call from his elderly father. It was the voice of a man interrupted. "Julian," I choked out. My throat felt like it was lined with broken glass from the smoke I'd inhaled. "Julian, it's Dad. The house. The house is gone. Everything is burning." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end. I expected a gasp. I expected him to ask if I was hurt, if I was warm, if I was safe. I expected to hear the rustle of sheets as he jumped out of bed to grab his car keys. "What do you mean, gone?" Julian's voice was clearer now, devoid of sleep, but filled with a cold, clinical annoyance. "How did you manage that, Dad?" "I don't know, son." I woke up, and the living room was a wall of fire. Leo pulled me out. I'm standing on the sidewalk. I have nothing. I don't even have shoes, Julian. Can I come to your place just for the night? I don't know where else to go. I looked up at the second story. The roof was starting to sag. A shower of sparks erupted into the night sky like a perverse celebration. I felt small. I felt like the sawdust I used to sweep off my workshop floor, discarded and weightless. "Look, Dad," Julian said, and I could almost hear him rubbing his temples, his voice dripping with a patronizing exhaustion. "Vicky and I have a huge presentation tomorrow morning. We've been working on this for weeks. You know how stressful our schedule is." He paused, and then came the words that felt colder than the snow under my heels. "You're a grown man, Dad. You've lived in that house for 30 years. If you left the stove on, or didn't check the wires, that's on you. We can't just drop everything every time you have a crisis. This isn't our problem. You should have been more careful." "Julian," I whispered, my voice failing me. "I'm in the street. It's 20 degrees out here. Call the Red Cross or something." "That's what insurance is for, right? We'll talk in a few days when things calm down. Don't call back tonight. Vicky is finally asleep." The line went flat. A dial tone is a lonely sound, but the silence that follows a son hanging up on his father is deafening. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the rhythmic beep, 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 until it felt like a nail being driven into my skull. My own son had just told me that my survival was a nuisance to his sleep schedule. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I flinched, my mind still trapped in the rejection of that phone call. It was Leo. He was wearing a heavy reflective work vest over his hoodie, the gear he wore for his late-night delivery runs. He had lived across the street for 3 years, a quiet man who kept his truck meticulously clean and always offered a polite nod when I was out raking leaves. We weren't friends. We were just 2 men who lived within sight of each other. Without saying a word, Leo stepped behind me and draped a thick wool Adirondack blanket over my shivering shoulders. The weight of it was staggering. It smelled like laundry detergent and old coffee, the most wonderful scents in the world at that moment. Sir Leo said, his voice low and steady, a sharp contrast to Julian's sharp staccato. My couch is yours for as long as you need it. My wife is already making some tea, and we've got a heater running in the guest nook. Let's get you out of the cold. I looked at Leo. He was a stranger. He didn't owe me anything. He didn't have my blood in his veins, and he didn't have 30 years of my memories in his head. Yet he was the one standing in the slush with me, while my son was tucked away in a warm bed, 3 towns over, complaining about a presentation. That was when the first sob broke through. I hadn't cried when I saw my workshop go up in flames. I hadn't cried when Margaret's photo melted into a black puddle. I had stayed strong because I thought I had a pillar to lean on. But the pillar had turned out to be a mirage. I wept then, deep shuddering heaves that shook my entire frame, not for the loss of the wood or the brick, but for the realization that I was truly alone in my own family. Leo didn't look away. He didn't act embarrassed by an old man's breakdown. He just kept his hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward his house, away from the flickering orange graveyard of my past. "It's okay, Mr. Miller," Leo muttered. "We've got you." As we walked, I noticed Leo's delivery truck parked in its usual spot right under the street lamp. It was there every night, a silent sentinel that saw everything that happened on this block while the rest of the world slept. I didn't think much of it then. I was too busy trying to keep my legs from buckling. Leo's house was small, but it felt like a cathedral of safety. He sat me down on a worn chocolate-colored leather sofa. It was soft and smelled of home. His wife, a kind-faced woman, whose name I didn't even know yet, handed me a mug of peppermint tea. The warmth seeped into my fingers, slowly bringing the feeling back to my joints. But the physical warmth couldn't touch the chill in my heart. Julian's words kept looping in my brain. Not our problem. I had taught that boy how to ride a bike on the very sidewalk where I just stood shivering. I had worked double shifts at the mill to pay for his business degree, so he would never have to worry about the things I worried about. And in return, I was told I was a grown man who should have been more careful. I lay down on that couch, eventually wrapped in Leo's wool blanket. The house across the street was quiet now, the fire department having reduced it to a steaming blackened shell. I stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows of the passing cars dance across the plaster. My mind began to drift back past the fire, past the phone call. I thought about the last time Julian had visited. It had been a Saturday exactly 7 days before the night everything burned. He hadn't come alone. Vicky was with him, clutching her designer handbag like it was a shield against my old-fashioned decor. Julian had been unusually cheerful that day. He had walked through the house, commenting on the furniture, asking about the status of the deed and checking the vents. He told me he wanted to modernize my life a bit. "You're falling behind the times, Dad," he'd said with that practiced toothy smile. Before they left, he had reached into the trunk of his car and pulled out a box. A high-end, sleek black speaker. He had insisted on setting it up right there in the living room, next to my favorite reading chair. A gift, he had called it, to bring some music back into this old place. I closed my eyes, the peppermint tea turning cold on the table beside me. I wondered why a son who couldn't be bothered to pick up his father from a fire would be so insistent on giving him a gift just 1 week before. 3 days after the fire, a man knocked on Leo's door at 8 in the morning. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a neighbor, or the rhythmic rap of a delivery driver. It was 3 solid authoritative strikes that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of Leo's modest living room. I was sitting in the same spot on the chocolate leather sofa, where Leo had placed me 72 hours earlier. I was wearing a pair of borrowed cargo pants that were 2 sizes too big, and a faded University of Connecticut sweatshirt. My life had been reduced to the view out the window, a direct line of sight to the blackened skeletal remains of 412 Prospect Avenue. From here, the house didn't look like a home anymore. It looked like a charred ribcage picked clean by the winter wind. Leo opened the door, his eyes still heavy from his late-night shift. The man standing on the porch was built like a retired linebacker, broad shoulders, weathered skin, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a navy blue tactical jacket with Fire Marshal embroidered in gold on the chest. He didn't smile, but he didn't look unkind. He simply held out a card between 2 thick calloused fingers. "Grant Sterling," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. "Fire Investigator, Hartford Fire Marshal's office. I'm looking for Benedict Miller." "He's right here," Leo said, stepping aside to let him in. Grant Sterling walked into the room, with a practiced gaze taking in the borrowed clothes and the cup of cold tea on the table in a single sweep. He pulled a small spiral-bound notebook from his pocket and sat in the chair opposite me. "Mr. Miller," he began, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. "I've spent 22 years digging through ashes in the state of Connecticut. I've seen everything from faulty Christmas lights to industrial explosions. My job is to find out where the spark started and, more importantly, why." I nodded slowly. I told the firemen that night. "I just woke up and it was everywhere." "I read their report," Grant said, flipping a page in his notebook. "Tell me your version. Start from when you went to bed. Take your time." I walked him through it. I described the silence of the snow, the ritual of taking out my hearing aids, and the heavy sleep of a man who thought his world was secure. I told him about the taste of the smoke, like burning plastic and old chemicals, and the terrifying moment I realized I was deaf in a room that was screaming for me to run. I reached for the hearing aid. I whispered the memory, making my chest tighten. I put it in, but it was dead. I just used it that evening. It should have worked. The battery didn't even give me the startup chime. Grant stopped writing. He looked at me over the top of his notebook. "You mentioned the battery, Mr. Miller. That's interesting. Tell me, when did you last change the batteries in that device?" I thought back to that Saturday 7 days before the night everything burned. I could see Julian standing in my kitchen, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "My son Julian." I said, a small flicker of pride still lingering in my voice despite the phone call on the sidewalk. "He changed them for me during his visit. He said he noticed I was straining to hear him. He brought a fresh pack. He said he wanted to make sure I was safe." Grant's expression didn't change, but his pen stayed poised above the paper. "And who else had access to your home in the week leading up to the fire? Any contractors, cleaning services? Other relatives?" "No," I replied. "Just Julian and his wife Vicky. They're the only ones with a key. They come by to help me with the house, keep things tidy." Grant scribbled something, a single long sentence that seemed to take an eternity to write. He didn't comment on Julian. He didn't ask about the phone call. He just kept his focus on the mechanics of the house. "Mr. Miller," Grant said, closing his notebook with a soft thud. "I've spent the last 48 hours at Prospect Avenue. We've been sifting through the living room, specifically around the area where you kept your furniture near the garage wall outlet." He stood up, adjusting his jacket. He looked toward the window at the ruins across the street. "In my experience," he said, his tone turning clinical, "fires like this one, they don't usually start by themselves. Electricity is predictable, arson is personal, and an accident is usually obvious within the first hour." He walked toward the door, then stopped, his hand on the frame. He turned back to me, his sharp eyes narrowing just a fraction. "I'll be in touch soon, but do me a favor. If you remember anything else, anything at all that felt new or different about the house that week, give me a call." I watched him walk down the porch steps and climb into a white SUV with the city seal on the door. For the first time in 3 days, the fog in my brain began to lift, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that I wasn't ready to face. Grant Sterling hadn't come here to offer sympathy. He had come here because something about my house didn't make sense to a man who had seen it all. The house hadn't just burned. It had been triggered. Leo came back into the room after seeing Grant out. "Intense guy," he muttered. "You okay, Mr. Miller?" "I'm fine, Leo." I lied. That evening, after Leo had gone to work and the house was silent, I found myself sitting at the small dining table. I reached into the pocket of the borrowed jacket I'd been wearing since the fire. My hand closed around a small rectangular object. I had been carrying it since the night of the fire, without fully stopping to register what it was. In the smoke and the chaos and the cold, I had swept it off the coffee table by pure instinct, the way a man grabs for anything familiar when everything else is burning. I had known it was there. I just had not yet made myself look at it directly. It was a small black plastic remote control. No brand name, no logos, just 4 buttons, A, B, C, and D. I stared at it under the dim kitchen light. Julian had left it there on that Saturday visit. He told me it came with the high-end speaker he'd gifted me. He said it was state-of-the-art, even though I told him I didn't need anything more than my old radio. "Just leave it on the table, Dad," he'd said with that dismissive wave of his hand. "It's for the volume and the settings. You won't even know it's there." I looked at the remote, then looked out the window at the blackened shell across the street. Grant's words echoed in the silence. "They don't usually start by themselves." I pressed button A. Nothing happened, of course. The speaker it belonged to was now a melted puddle of toxic plastic in a heap of ash. But as I held the remote, I realized it felt heavier than it should. It felt like a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. Julian had given me a gift, and Julian had changed my batteries. I gripped the remote until the plastic edges dug into my palm. I sat there in Leo's quiet house staring at that small black device, and for the first time, I didn't just feel like a victim. I felt like a witness. I couldn't sleep again that night. So I did what old men do when sleep won't come. I sat in the dark and I remembered. In the quiet of Leo's living room, the darkness felt thick, almost tactile. My mind drifted back to a week before the world turned to ash. I could almost smell the white pine again, almost feel the warmth of the radiator in my old hallway. It was Saturday, January 4th, a typical Hartford afternoon, gray biting with a light snow, dusting the porch. I had turned that Saturday over in my mind a dozen times since the night Leo made me scrambled eggs. Not the broad strokes I already knew. Julian had come, brought the speaker stayed for coffee. What I kept coming back to lying in the dark were the details I had been too trusting to catch at the time. The way his shoulders were angled away from me when he knelt by the outlet. The way his back was slightly hunched, his hands shielded from my line of sight as he worked with the wires. A man setting up a gift for his father has nothing to hide. A man installing a device he doesn't want examined keeps his hands out of view. He was meticulous about where he placed it. He didn't just put it on a shelf. He moved the side table a fraction of an inch, ensuring the speaker was plugged directly into the wall socket right beside where I spent my evenings reading. He spent a good 10 minutes fiddling with the wires, his back to me. I thought he was just being a perfectionist. I thought he cared about the aesthetics of my home. When he stood up, he handed me a small black plastic remote. "This controls the speaker, Dad. Simple. Just one click. Leave it right here on the coffee table so you don't lose it." I'd turned the remote over in my hand. It was light, unremarkable. I shoved it into my cardigan pocket, distracted by his sudden change in tone. He'd moved to the kitchen, putting on a pot of coffee, acting like the dutiful son. While the coffee brewed, Julian sat across from me. He didn't talk about his work or the weather. Instead, he started asking about the logistics of my life. Vicky and I were talking, Dad, about the future. "You've got this place paid off, right? The deed is in the safe." "Of course," I told him, touched that he was thinking about my security. "Everything is where it should be. Margaret and I made sure of that. I've even got a bit put away in the savings account at Hartford National." "Why do you ask, son?" "Just making sure you're protected." He said, his eyes scanning the room, never quite meeting mine. Identity theft is a big deal these days. You have to be careful who has access to your papers. I felt a surge of warmth toward him. I felt protected. Before he left, he noticed me squinting as I adjusted the volume on my radio. "Is your hearing aid acting up again?" he asked, his voice dripping with concern. "Let me see it." He took the device from me. I watched him pull a fresh pack of batteries from his pocket. He turned his back to me again, shielding the device with his shoulders as he worked. "There," he said, handing it back. "Fresh juice. I don't want you missing a thing, Dad. Especially not the smoke alarms. You've got to stay sharp." I put the device back in my ear. It worked perfectly, clear as a bell. I had no way of knowing that the fresh batteries he'd inserted were nearly depleted, just enough charge to get through the evening, but not enough to last the week, and certainly not enough to power the internal speaker of the aid when it needed to alert me to a crisis in the dead of night. When he left, he gave me a long, firm hug. It was the kind of hug that felt like a goodbye, though I didn't recognize it at the time. He smiled that warm, practiced Julian smile and told me he'd check in soon. The memory snapped like a dry twig as a car drove past Leo's house, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling. I was back in the dark. I reached into the pocket of the borrowed jacket and pulled out the small black remote Julian had given me. In the moonlight, I looked at it. Julian didn't do things by accident. He never had. Not once in 45 years had my son ever been helpful without a hidden agenda. He didn't bring that speaker to give me music. He brought it to give me a fire. He didn't change my batteries to help me hear. He changed them to ensure I was trapped in silence when it mattered most. The weight of the realization was a physical blow. I clutched the remote so hard the plastic groaned. I had spent my life building a home for a man who spent 8 months planning to turn it into a coffin. The silence of the house was interrupted by the sudden vibration of my phone on the side table. It was a text message from a number I'd saved 3 days ago. Grant Sterling. I checked the timestamp. 6:15 a.m. "Mr. Miller, I need you to come down to the fire marshal's office as soon as you can this morning. We've finished the forensic sweep of the living room debris." My fingers trembled as I typed back a short confirmation. But it was the second text that made my blood run cold. "We found something in the ashes, Mr. Miller. Something that didn't belong in any speaker. It was fused to your wall outlet." I looked at the remote in my hand. Then I looked at the window, where the sun was beginning to bleed over the Hartford skyline. The truth was no longer a shadow in the back of my mind. It was coming for Julian, and I was the only one who could tell the story. Grant Sterling's office smelled like burnt wood and strong coffee, the scent of a man who spent his career sifting through what fire left behind. It was a sterile, functional space in the basement of the Hartford Fire Marshal's office, filled with steel filing cabinets and high-resolution photographs of charred structures that looked like skeletal remains. I walked in at 9 a.m. sharp, still wearing Leo's borrowed boots. Grant was leaning over a large stainless steel table in the center of the room. He didn't look up when I entered. He was too busy adjusting a magnifying lamp over a collection of small, heat-discolored metal fragments. "Sit down, mister." "Miller," Grant said, his voice as gravelly as the road outside. "I wanted you here to see this before I hand it over to the State Police Forensic Lab. You deserve to know what we found in your living room." I sat. My heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. On the table, arranged in clear plastic evidence bags, were the remnants of my life. Grant picked up a small bag containing a charred, rectangular circuit board, no bigger than a matchbox. "This is what's left of that high-end speaker your son gave you." Grant began, his eyes fixed on the blackened silicon. "But here's the problem, Mr. Miller. High-end speakers don't come with a 433 MHz RF smart outlet receiver fused inside them. And they certainly don't come with a resistance heating element wrapped in acoustic cotton." I stared at the fragment. "I don't understand, Grant. It was just a speaker. That's what it was supposed to look like." Grant said, his tone turning cold and clinical. "This wasn't a Wi-Fi plug. No IP address to track, no cloud logs to subpoena. This was a low-frequency RF smart outlet, the kind used for simple remote-controlled lights. But someone modified it. They bypassed the safety fuse and connected it to a digital timer hidden behind the speaker's base port. It was set for 11:45 p.m. He leaned in closer, the light reflecting off his sharp eyes. The cotton inside the speaker, the stuff meant to dampen the sound, was soaked in a trace amount of mineral spirits. When that timer hit 0, the heating element turned red hot. In a closed box full of treated cotton, it didn't just burn. It smoldered until it had enough heat to flash over. It was a perfect self-contained fire starter. No remote activation needed at the time of the fire. The clock was already ticking when Julian plugged it in a week ago. I felt the air leave my lungs. I remember Julian kneeling by the outlet. "I was cleaning out some equipment at the office," he'd said. "I thought you'd enjoy some music." "But the smoke alarm?" I whispered. "Why didn't I hear the alarm?" Grant reached for a second bag. Inside was my hearing aid, the one I'd reached for in the dark. Beside it were 2 small silver button cell batteries. "This is twist number 1, Mr. Miller," Grant said, his voice softening just a fraction. "We ran a voltage test on these batteries. They weren't old and they weren't faulty. They had been deliberately depleted. Someone used a battery drainer, a common tool for hobbyists to suck 95% of the energy out of them, before putting them back in the pack." He tapped the table for emphasis. "They were designed to work just well enough for you to hear your son say, 'Good night,' but not long enough to survive the night. When you put that device in your ear while the house was filling with smoke, the circuitry tried to pull power to initialize the noise-canceling software. But the batteries were too weak to handle the load. They died the second you needed them to live. The silence in the office was absolute. I looked at the RF fragment. The gift. I looked at the batteries, the concern. It was a 3-layer trap. First, ensure I was deaf by swapping the batteries. Second, ensure I was asleep by choosing a time when a 72-year-old man is always in bed. Third, ensure the fire was inevitable by using a non-traceable timed RF device. He didn't just want the house to burn. I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, flat, hollow, devoid of the shaking I felt inside. He wanted me to stay in it. Grant sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of all the betrayals he'd investigated over 2 decades. "Mr. Miller, fires like this are usually about one of 2 things, anger or money. Given that your house was paid off and you have a substantial insurance policy, I think we know which one this is." He straightened up his broad shoulders, casting a long shadow over the evidence. "Whoever did this planned for you not to make it out of that house. They wanted a clean accident, a grieving son, and a $500,000 check from Hartford Mutual. I looked at the blackened photo of Margaret that Grant had salvaged, the one where our smiles were now just bubbles in the silver. For 72 years, I had played by the rules. I had been a father. I had been a husband. I had trusted the blood that came from my own veins. That man was gone. He had burned up at 11:47 p.m. on January 11th. "Julian," I said. It was the first time I had said his name since the sidewalk. It didn't sound like a father calling his son. It sounded like a judge reading a sentence. "His name is Julian Miller. He lives in West Hartford. He works in commercial real estate. And he has a wife named Vicky who helps him with his logistics." Grant didn't look surprised. He picked up his pen and began to write the name down in his spiral notebook. He did it slowly, deliberately, the ink scratching against the paper like a promise being carved into stone. "Julian Miller," Grant repeated. "I've already flagged the insurance claim. They won't be seeing a dime while this investigation is open. But, Mr. Miller, if we're going to take down someone who spends their life dealing with high-stakes contracts and legal loopholes, we need more than just melted plastic. We need to follow the paper trail." He closed his notebook and looked at me with a grim sort of respect. "Before I move forward with the state police, there's someone I think you need to meet. She's an expert in the kind of accidents that happen to people of your age when there's a lot of money on the line." He handed me a different business card. This one wasn't gold and navy. It was heavy cream cardstock with elegant sharp black lettering. Clara Vance, elder law and forensic estate litigation. "Go see her this afternoon," Grant said. "I've already sent her the preliminary fire report. She's waiting for you." I took the card. I didn't look back at the evidence. I didn't look back at the blackened remains of my life. I walked out of that basement and into the cold Hartford sun, the small RF remote still heavy in my pocket. Julian thought he had written the ending to my story. He thought the fire had finished me. But as I sat in my car and looked at Clara Vance's name, I realized the fire hadn't finished anything. It had only just begun to reveal what was hidden in the dark. Clara Vance arrived at Leo's door the following afternoon. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her late 30s, with a sharp bobbed haircut and a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen more courtrooms than I'd seen woodworking shops. Her eyes were a cool, observant gray, the kind of eyes that missed nothing, not even the faint tremble in my hands as I offered her a seat. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice steady and professional, as she sat across from me at Leo's small dining table. "I'm an elder law attorney. Grant Sterling sent me your file. My job is to protect people who have spent a lifetime building something only to have it targeted by those closest to them. And I believe someone has been systematically stealing from you for months." I leaned back, the word stealing hitting me like a physical weight. "I don't have much to steal anymore, Clara. Just a blackened lot on Prospect Avenue." "That blackened lot is exactly the point," she replied, clicking open the brass latches of her briefcase. She pulled out a thick folder and slid a document across the table. It was a formal insurance policy from Hartford Mutual, dated October the 2024. "This is an amendment to your homeowner's policy," Clara explained, pointing to a highlighted section. "The coverage was increased to $500,000. But look at the primary beneficiaries. It's no longer just you. In the event of a total loss where the owner is incapacitated or deceased, the payout goes 100% to Julian and Vicky Miller." I stared at the names. My own son, my daughter-in-law. I never signed this. I remember Julian talking about updating the policy for inflation, but I told him I'd handle it when I went to the bank. "You didn't have to go to the bank, Mr. Miller," Clara said. "In the United States, adding beneficiaries who don't have a valid insurable interest, meaning they don't share the financial burden of the property under fraudulent pretenses, is a federal offense. It's insurance fraud. Because this involved a major financial institution, I've already filed a referral with the National Insurance Crime Bureau. Given the dollar amount and the federal nature of the fraud, they will escalate this to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit within the week. They've opened a preliminary file." I looked at the bottom of the page. There it was, my signature, Benedict Miller. It looked perfect. The same sweeping B, the same sharp M I'd practiced since grade school. "It looks like mine," I whispered. "It resembles yours," Clara corrected, pulling out a second sheet of paper, a high-resolution scan, with red circles around certain parts of my name. "Our forensic document examiner spent 4 hours with this last night. He found what we call hesitation marks at 4 specific points. Small, microscopic tremors where the pen lingered a fraction of a second too long. It's the sign of a hand that is thinking rather than reacting. Someone didn't just sign this, they practiced it. She leaned forward, her gaze intensifying. Mr. Miller, I need to ask you something very specific. Does your daughter-in-law Vicky have regular access to your personal documents? Does she help you with your mail? The memory hit me with the force of a cold wave. I saw Vicky sitting at my kitchen table last November, her designer glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through a stack of old papers. She always offered to help. I said the words feeling heavy. I'm not good with the new digital systems. She'd say, Dad, let me handle the administrative stuff. You just focus on your woodworking. I remember one afternoon we were clearing out a kitchen drawer. I found a box of old personal checks from an account I closed years ago. I was going to burn them, but Vicky took them. She said she'd bring them to her office and put them through the industrial shredder for me. She said it was safer that way. Clara nodded slowly, a grim silhouette of a smile touching her lips. She didn't shred them. Mr. Miller, Clara said, I believe she kept them. Once our forensic team gets into their home records, I expect we'll find out exactly what she did with them. But if my instinct is right, those old checks gave her everything she needed to put your name on a document you never agreed to sign. I looked out the window at the snow. I thought about the times Vicky had brought me cookies, or the times she'd laughed at my stories about Margaret. Every one of those moments now felt like a calculation. She helped me with paperwork for years, Clara. I said, my voice barely audible. I thought she was being kind. I thought I was lucky to have a daughter-in-law who cared enough to manage the boring parts of an old man's life. Kindness is the favorite mask of the predator, Clara said, her tone softening but remaining firm. Vicky provided the pen, and Julian provided the spark. They were a team, Mr. Miller. While Julian was making sure you couldn't hear the fire, Vicky was making sure they'd get paid for it. She closed the folder with a definitive snap. The sound seemed to signal the end of my mourning period. I wasn't just an old man on a sofa anymore. I was a witness in a federal investigation. Clara, I said, looking back at her, what happens now? Now we build the rest of the wall, she replied. The insurance fraud is the crack in their foundation, but we need the core. The FBI will move, but they move slowly. We need something that links their intent to the fire directly, or something that shows they were planning for a future that didn't include you. She stood up, adjusted her blazer, and looked at me with a steady, unwavering confidence. Mr. Miller, the forged signature is serious, but I need you to think carefully. Is there any document, any appointment, anything at all in the past 6 months that felt unusual? Anything Julian insisted you attend in person, or anywhere he took you, where you had to sign a stack of papers you didn't fully read? I closed my eyes. I searched through the fog of the last few months past the holidays and the cold Connecticut mornings. And then a memory flickered, a sterile office, a small clinic Julian had driven me to in the heat of August. He'd told me it was just a routine checkup for my insurance. I remembered being tired that day. I remembered a woman in a dark suit standing in the corner of the room. There was a clinic, I muttered, opening my eyes. In August, Julian was very insistent. He said the insurance company required a wellness certification for my age. Clara's eyes sharpened. Did you sign anything there, Mr. Miller? A few things. Julian said it was just medical release forms. I was so tired. He gave me some water, and I just wanted to go home. Clara didn't say a word. She just opened her notebook and wrote, August Clinic. I'll look into the notary records for the date, she said. Mr. Miller, I think we're about to find out exactly how much your life was worth to your son. That night, something Clara said kept turning in my mind, grinding like a rusted gear. Any appointment Julian insisted you attend in person. I sat in the dark of Leo's living room, watching the streetlights catch the falling snow, and then it hit me like smoke, clearing after a flashover to reveal the structural rot beneath. It was August 2024. Hartford was suffocating under a late summer heat wave. Julian had driven me to a small private clinic on the outskirts of the city. Not my usual doctor, not the man who had looked after my heart for 20 years. Julian told me it was a mandatory wellness certification required by a new insurance provider to keep my premiums low. I remembered the office clearly now. It was sterile, windowless, and smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. Julian had sat right next to me the entire time. A woman in a dark suit, not a nurse, kept sliding stacks of paperwork across a mahogany desk. Just standard medical release forms, Dad. Julian had whispered, his hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. Sign here and here, and this one for the privacy update. I remembered feeling unusually tired that afternoon. My head felt heavy, the legal jargon on the pages blurring into a mess of black ink. I had drunk the water Julian offered me, and within minutes, I just wanted to be home in my chair, away from the hum of the fluorescent lights. I signed everything he pointed to. I trusted the hand on my shoulder. That evening, I had slept for 6 hours straight, a deep, dreamless sleep that left me feeling hollow when I woke up. At 7 a.m. the next morning, I called Clara. My voice was a ghost of itself as I recounted the details of that August afternoon. She didn't interrupt. I only heard the steady rhythmic scratching of her pen on a legal pad. "Meet me at my office at 2 o'clock, Mr. Miller." She said, her tone as sharp as a razor. "I'll have the records by then." When I walked into Clara's office that afternoon, the sunlight was streaming through the blinds, casting long, cage-like shadows across the room. Clara didn't waste time with pleasantries. She laid a single-stamped invoice on the table. "It wasn't a wellness certification, Mr. Miller." Clara said, her gray eyes fixed on mine. "This is a non-refundable admission deposit for Riverside Care Facility in East Hartford. Julian paid $15,000 to secure a bed for you on September 15th, 3 months before the fire." I looked at the paper. Riverside Care. I knew the place. A gray concrete fortress tucked away in an industrial zone, known for its locked wards and the lonely silence of residents whose families had forgotten them. "Why," I whispered, the air in the room suddenly feeling as thin as it had during the fire. "He was planning the fire. Why pay for a nursing home?" Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, steady cadence. "Because Julian is a man who plans for every contingency. He prepared for both outcomes. If you didn't make it out of that house on Prospect Avenue, the fire would have looked like a tragic accident. He and Vicky would have walked away with a $500,000 insurance payout and your entire estate immediately." She tapped the invoice with a manicured fingernail. "But if you survived what you did, he had a plan B. He would use the papers you signed in that clinic to declare you incompetent, citing diminished mental capacity after the trauma of a fire. He'd move you into Riverside, a place where you would be isolated, cut off from the world, and under his total legal control. Once you were locked away, he'd manage the insurance money and the sale of your land, without you ever being able to utter a word of protest. Either way, Julian won. He had arranged your ending long before he ever brought that speaker into your home." I sat in absolute silence. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing left but that piece of paper and the crushing weight of the truth. I thought of the hugs, the "I love you, Dad" at the door, the way he'd help me rake the leaves. It was all a performance. Every moment of affection was just a brick in the wall of a prison he was building for me. For the first time since the night everything burned, I cried. It wasn't the frantic weeping of a victim. It was the slow, agonizing heartbreak of a father who realized he had raised a monster. I sat in Clara's expensive leather chair and let the tears soak into the University of Connecticut sweatshirt Leo had lent me. I didn't cry because I was afraid of Riverside. I cried because Julian had looked at my 72 years of life and seen nothing but a balance sheet to be liquidated. He had priced my heartbeat. He had measured my worth in square footage and insurance premiums. He had arranged everything. I choked out my hands, gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. Whether I lived or died, Julian had already made the arrangements. I was already gone to him. Clara waited. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She let me feel the bottom of the abyss. Only when my breathing finally slowed did she reach into her desk and pull out a fresh document. "Mr. Miller," she said quietly. "I know this is the lowest point, but there is a reason I'm an elder law attorney. I've seen men like Julian before. They always think they're the smartest person in the room because they control the paper. But they forget that life happens outside of the paperwork." I wiped my face looking up at her. What else could there be? He's covered every track. "Not every track." Clara said, a grim shadow of a smile appearing on her face. "Grant Sterling called me just before you arrived. He's been doing some canvassing. He found something, Mr. Miller. Something Julian didn't know existed. Something that wasn't inside your house, but was watching it the entire time." I stood up, my legs trembling, but my mind suddenly felt cold and clear, like the winter air outside. "What did he find?" Clara closed her folder and grabbed her coat. "We need to go back to Leo's house. Grant is waiting for us there. He says we need to look at something on Leo's delivery truck." The realization hit me like a physical jolt. Leo, the quiet neighbor who worked the night shift. The truck that sat under the street lamp every single night, while Julian thought he was operating in the dark. I followed Clara out of the office, the small black RF remote, still heavy in my pocket. Julian had written a script where I died or disappeared. He had planned for the fire, and he had planned for the silence. But he hadn't planned for the man across the street. The truth begins to emerge from the smallest details that the villain never anticipated. To let me know you're still with Ben on his quest for justice, please comment 1 below. And please note, the following events will contain some fictional elements to enhance the educational and experiential aspect. If you find this unsuitable, you can stop here. Leo's delivery truck had been parked across from my house every night for 3 years. It was a bulky white Ford Transit with a few faded decals from the logistics firm he worked for, usually caked in the gray salt and slush of a Connecticut winter. To the rest of the world, it was just another piece of city machinery, as invisible as a fire hydrant or a street sign. Leo never thought twice about it. It was his office, his sanctuary after a long shift. Julian, for all his meticulous plannings and his high-priced West Hartford education, didn't think twice about it either. To a man like my son, a delivery truck was just background noise, a utility meant to serve people like him, not to watch them. We were back in Leo's living room, the space feeling smaller now, with the presence of Grant Sterling and Clara Vance. The air was heavy with the smell of Leo's reheated coffee and the clinical sharp scent of the folders Clara had brought. Grant stood by a portable monitor he'd hooked up to a rugged military-grade laptop on the small dining table. Julian Miller isn't just a greedy son, Ben. Grant began, his fingers hovering over the keyboard with a practiced stillness. He's a professional. He knows how Hartford works. He knows that in a city like this, every modern apartment building and every major intersection is blanketed in surveillance. He's a real estate man. He understands the eyes of the city, so he took steps to blind them. Grant tapped a key displaying a grainy digital log from the security system of the luxury apartment complex adjacent to my old house. On the night of January 5th, the night he brought that speaker over the security footage for the main entrance, and the side alleyway was wiped clean between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. When I questioned the night maintenance supervisor this morning, he finally cracked. He admitted a man claiming to be a real estate broker had approached him a few days prior. This broker said he was evaluating the building's security infrastructure for a potential institutional buyer. He handed over $500 in cash just to test the backup system by deleting a small segment of non-critical footage. He told the guard it was a routine stress test for the server. It was clean, efficient, and almost undetectable. Julian, I muttered the name, feeling like ash in my mouth. The audacity of it made my stomach churn. He hadn't just committed a crime. He had managed the very environment around it, treating my life like a line item in a budget he could simply erase. Exactly, Grant said, a grim, humorless smile touching his lips. He controlled the fixed cameras. He knew exactly where the building's blind spots were. He thought he was operating in a void. But he forgot about the mobile ones. He forgot about the guy who works the graveyard shift and parks a high-definition motion-activated dash cam directly facing your front porch every single night. Grant looked at Leo, who was leaning against the kitchen counter looking paler than I'd ever seen him. Leo, show him what your truck saw. Leo stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he manipulated the playback software. I bought this camera after someone clipped my side mirror while I was sleeping last winter. He explained softly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. It's a professional-grade unit wired to the truck's auxiliary battery. It records whenever it senses movement within 20 feet of the front bumper. I never even look at the footage unless there's a dent on the fender. The screen flickered to life. The date in the bottom corner read January 5th, 2025. The time was 1:23 a.m. The street on the monitor was bathed in the eerie orange-yellow glow of the Hartford street lamps. The snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes, muffling the world in a white shroud. For a few seconds there was nothing but the empty street. Then a dark European sedan. Julian's car pulled into the frame, idling quietly a few doors down from my porch. A man stepped out. He was wearing a heavy charcoal overcoat with the collar turned up high and a dark baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Even in the grainy night vision of the dash cam, the silhouette was unmistakable to a father's eyes. He walked to the trunk, opened it with a fluid, practiced motion, and lifted out a large square box. "Wait!" I said, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Zoom in on his face. Grant enhanced the image. The snow blurred the details, but the man's profile was sharp against the porch light. It was the way he carried himself, the slight arrogant hitch in his left shoulder, the expensive Italian leather boots clicking rhythmically on the frozen pavement. He walked right up to my porch, looked around for a split second with a predatory quickness, and then used his own key to enter my home. 7 minutes later, the door opened again. He emerged without the box. He paused on the top step, adjusting his leather gloves, looking satisfied. He looked directly toward Leo's truck. "That's when it happened," Leo whispered, pointing at the screen. "I was just getting back from my first run. I was sitting in the cab finishing a cold sandwich before heading inside. I saw him coming out. He didn't look like a burglar. He looked like he owned the place. He actually caught my eye through the windshield, gave me a little half-wave, totally casual, and said, 'Just dropping off a late holiday gift from my dad. He's a light sleeper, didn't want to wake him.' I remember thinking, man, I wish my kid was that thoughtful when I'm 70. I watched the footage again, then a third time. They say third time's a charm, but this felt like a slow-motion execution. I watched my son, my only child, the boy I'd taught to carve wood in that very garage, carrying a timed incendiary device into my home at 1 a.m. while I slept, then waving at a neighbor with the practice-chilling ease of a saint. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just sat there nodding slowly, a rhythmic mechanical motion that felt like the only way to keep my head from exploding. The betrayal was no longer just a feeling. It was a high-definition digital file. It was a physical weight in the room, heavier than the blackened ruins across the street. This is the probable cause I needed for the district attorney. Grant said, his voice regaining its professional investigative steel. He began printing out high-resolution stills from the video. The printer's mechanical hum, the only sound in the silent apartment. "We have him entering with the box. We have the RF device remnants I pulled from your wall outlet. We have the insurance fraud files Clara is building in New Haven. It's a complete circuit, Ben." He shoved the warm photos into a thick manila folder and snapped the metal clasps shut. "Mr. Miller," Grant said, looking me dead in the eye with a look of profound, grim respect. "I'm going to the DA's office tonight. I'll be filing for a formal arrest warrant by tomorrow morning. Between the federal insurance fraud and the attempted arson, Julian won't have enough bail money or high-priced lawyers in the world to keep him out of a cell. It's not enough." I said, my voice surprising me with its sudden Arctic coldness. I wasn't shaking anymore. "He's smart. He'll claim the speaker was just a speaker, a refurbished unit he bought online. He'll claim he didn't know it was faulty. He'll say the dash cam just shows a son being nice to his father at an odd hour. That's where the final piece comes in," Clara Vance said, stepping away from the window. She looked at me with a professional focus that was as sharp as a scalpel. "The dash cam proves he lied about his whereabouts. The fire marshal proves how the fire was set. But we still need to lock down the intent, the why behind the forged signature on that insurance policy. We need to show that this wasn't an accident, but a hostile takeover of your life." As we began to walk back toward the small guest nook where I'd been sleeping, Grant stopped me at the door. The winter wind was picking up outside, whistling through the gaps in the porch railing like a morning flute. "There's still the question of the signature, Ben," Grant said quietly, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Clara thinks she has the answer, but it's going to require us to look at something Julian and Vicky assumed was already gone, something they thought they'd disposed of months ago in their home office." I looked at him, my mind racing through the ash and the soot. What could be left? Everything I owned is gone. "Not everything," Grant replied, looking back toward the blackened silhouette of Prospect Avenue. "Julian is a man of the digital age, Ben. He trusts his shredders and his delete buttons. He thinks if he burns the paper, the truth burns with it. But he forgot one simple rule of the modern world. Machines have memories of their own. And sometimes they're much more honest than the people who own them." I stood there in the hallway staring at the floor. Machines have memories. I thought of Vicky and her kindness with my paperwork. I thought of the printer in their home office that I'd seen her use 100 times. And I realized that the paper trail didn't end in the fire. It started in their own house, hidden in the digital bones of a machine they thought was just a tool. Clara called the next morning, with that careful tone she used when she had found something significant, controlled, precise, like she was measuring every word before she spoke it. It wasn't the voice of someone delivering good news. It was the voice of a surgeon explaining a complicated X-ray. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice crackling slightly over the car's Bluetooth as I sat in Leo's driveway. "I need you at my office, now. The State Police Digital Forensics team just finished a mirror dump of the hardware seized from Julian's home office in West Hartford. Grant had obtained a separate search warrant for Julian's West Hartford residence 48 hours earlier, Signed by a superior court judge on the basis of the dash cam footage and the insurance fraud referral. The printer was among the first items seized. You need to see what they found in the metadata. I didn't ask questions. I just drove. By 10 a.m., I was back in that wood-paneled office, the winter sun of Hartford, casting long, cold shadows across Clara's desk. She didn't offer me coffee this time. She simply turned her computer monitor toward me. Julian is a real estate broker, so he uses a high-end commercial-grade laser printer in his home office. Clara began her fingers tapping a rhythm on the desk. Most people think when they print a document, the data simply vanishes into the paper. But modern printers have internal storage, a print log, that keeps a record of every file name sent to the queue. Julian and Vicky thought that because they shredded the physical paper, the evidence was gone. They forgot about the machine's memory. She scrolled down a long clinical list of file names and timestamps. My eyes blurred for a second, then sharpened on a recurring sequence of entries from late 2024. Look at the file names, Mr. Miller, Clara whispered. SIG_practice_V 1.pdf. Printed August 12th, 2024, 11:14 p.m. SIG_practice_V 5.pdf. Printed August 28th, 2024, 1:05 a.m. SIG_practice_V 23. PDF. Printed November 4th, 2024, 11:42 p.m. 23 files, spanning 4 months, all leading up to the date the insurance policy was amended. I don't understand, I said, though deep down, the gears were already turning. What were they practicing? They weren't practicing a sales pitch, Clara said. She pulled a physical folder from her drawer and laid out several sheets of paper. They were high-resolution scans of my old personal checks, the ones Vicky had promised to shred for me back in November. The memory surged back vivid and painful. I saw Vicky sitting on my floor surrounded by dusty boxes. She had held up the old checkbooks with a sympathetic smile. "Oh, Dad, you can't just throw these in the trash. Identity thieves look for stuff like this. Let me take them to the office. I'll put them through the industrial shredder myself. It'll give us both peace of mind." I had thanked her. I had literally hugged the woman as she walked out of my house with the blueprints for my financial ruin tucked under her arm. She didn't shred them, Mr. Miller. Clara's voice cut through the memory. She used them. A personal check is the holy grail for a forger. It contains your legal signature written in your own hand, repeated hundreds of times. It shows your flourishes, your pressure points, the way your hand tires by the end of the line. Vicky didn't just take your checks, she took your identity. Clara pointed back to the screen. The digital forensics show that these SIG_practice files were scans of your checks overlaid with a transparency layer. Vicky was using the office's graphic design software to trace your signature. She printed out sheet after sheet of your name, practicing the curves of the B and the sharp tail of the R in Miller. She sat at her kitchen table. I whispered the image forming in my mind with terrifying clarity. I could see her, Vicky, the woman who brought me homemade lasagna, sitting under a designer lamp in West Hartford. I could see her holding a pen brow furrowed in concentration, signing my name over and over again until the hesitation marks were almost gone. She practiced my name, Clara, night after night. She wasn't just signing a document, she was erasing me. She was becoming the version of Benedict Miller that could sign away a life's work. The forensic document examiner confirmed it this morning. Clara added, her tone turning grim. The signature on the $500,000 insurance policy amendment wasn't a rushed job. It was the result of months of rehearsal. She waited until she was perfect. Then she signed the death warrant for your home. I looked at the timestamps on the screen. 1:05 a.m., 11:42 p.m. While I was sleeping soundly in the house I'd built with Margaret, thinking I was safe, because my family was looking out for me, they were awake in the dark, perfecting the lie that would turn my sanctuary into an ash heap. The betrayal felt different today. It wasn't the hot, searing rage of the fire or the cold shock of Julian's phone call. It was a dull, heavy ache, the realization that the people I loved had spent more time studying my handwriting than they had ever spent listening to my stories. She practiced it. I repeated my voice, a hollow rasp. She sat there and signed Benedict Miller until the ink felt like her own. Clara watched me for a long moment, allowing the weight of the digital evidence to settle. She knew that in a court of law, this printer log was a smoking gun. It showed premeditation. It showed intent. It turned an accident into a cold-blooded conspiracy. "It's a complete circuit now," Clara said softly. "We have the physical device from Grant, the dash cam footage of the delivery, and now the digital trail of the forgery. There is no accidental explanation for 23 versions of a signature practice file." She closed the digital log, the screen going black, reflecting our faces in the glass. But she didn't stand up to end the meeting. Instead, she reached for a second folder, thinner than the others, and noticeably newer. "Clara," I asked, noticing the way her jaw tightened. "Is there more?" "There is always more with men like Julian," she replied. She opened the folder and pulled out a document embossed with a gold seal. "Mr. Miller, I asked you before about that clinic visit in August. I followed the trail of the notary public who was present that day. His name is Marcus Thorne. He's a mobile notary who does a lot of contract work for Julian's real estate firm." I leaned in, my heart beginning to thud in my chest. I remembered the woman in the suit, the sterile room, and the water that made me so sleepy. "Do you remember signing anything at that clinic, Mr. Miller? Anything at all?" Clara asked, her eyes searching mine. "Because Julian told the insurance company you were signing wellness forms. But I've been looking at the official notary records from that afternoon in August, and what I found in those files, it's going to change everything we thought we knew about this case." She slid a document toward me. It wasn't an insurance form. It wasn't a medical release. At the top of the page in bold, terrifying letters were the words, "Last Will and Testament." "He didn't just want the house, Ben," Clara whispered. "He was making sure that even if the fire failed, you were already dead on paper." Cliffhanger. I stared at the gold seal, my vision tunneling. I hadn't just signed my medical history away that day. I had signed my own legacy into the hands of my executioners. The room felt cold, the Hartford sun no longer reaching the corners of the office. I have signed my name thousands of times in 72 years. On loan papers for the first truck I ever bought, on birthday cards for Julian when he was a boy, on the deed to the house on Prospects Avenue, and on the agonizingly long hospital forms during Margaret's final days. I know what my signature means. It is a man's bond, his word made ink. That is why what Clara showed me next felt like the ground opening beneath my feet, swallowing the very foundation of who I thought I was. "Ben Boif," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, somber tone. She didn't look at the screen this time. She looked directly at me. I spent the last 2 hours verifying the records from that clinic visit in August. I tracked down the filing with the Hartford County Notary Registry. This is what you actually signed while you thought you were updating your health insurance. She slid a document across the mahogany desk. At the top, in a font that looked cold and final, were the words, "Last Will and Testament of Benedict Miller." I stared at it. My vision tunneled. I never asked for a new will, Clara. My will was made in 1998. Everything was supposed to be simple. Julian made it complicated, Clara replied. She flipped to the second page, highlighting a section in yellow. This new will supersedes all previous versions. It names Julian and Vicky as the sole executors and primary beneficiaries. It grants them immediate control over your entire estate, including your remaining bank accounts and a $200,000 life insurance policy I didn't even know you had. I leaned back, the air in the office suddenly feeling far too thin. The memory of the clinic returned sharper now. I saw Julian flipping through a thick stack of papers in that sterile windowless room. He was talking fast, using words like premium adjustments, provider networks, and deductible waivers. "Just a few more pages, Dad," he had said, pointing to the signature lines. "The insurance company is being a pain about these updates. I've already read through it all. It's just the usual red tape. Sign here so we can go grab that lunch I promised you." I had signed. I hadn't read a single word. Why would I? My son was the one holding the pen. He was the one who had spent years handling the administrative stuff for me. I wasn't drugged. I wasn't confused by medicine. I was blinded by a 45-year-old belief that my son loved me. He used undue influence. Clara explained, her lawyer's mind already building the case, and a classic technique called document confusion. He buried a life-altering legal instrument in a pile of mundane administrative forms. He lied to you about the nature of the document to gain your signature. In the eyes of the law, that's fraud, Ben. But the woman, the notary, I stammered. She was right there. She watched me sign. Her name is Marcus Thorne's associate. We believe she was paid $15,000 in cash by Julian's real estate firm to facilitate this. Clara said, her jaw tightening. Under Connecticut law, a notary public has a duty to ensure the signer understands the document. By confirming a signature on a document she knew was being misrepresented to you, she committed notary fraud. It's a serious crime, and it's the key to unraveling his entire plan. Clara stood up and began pacing the small office, her heels clicking like a ticking clock. Look at the timeline, Ben. It's a 3-tier plan. Tier 1, the fire. That was supposed to give them $500,000 in homeowners insurance immediately. Tier 2, the Riverside Care Facility. If you survived, you'd be isolated in a locked ward, effectively silenced. Tier 3. This will, once you passed away, whether from natural causes in that home or the trauma of the fire, they would collect another $200,000 in life insurance plus the sale of your land. Total take, nearly $1 million. I looked out the window at the Hartford skyline, but I didn't see the buildings. I saw the ghost of the man I used to be, a man who fixed his son's car, a man who was proud of his son's success. He didn't just want my house, Clara. I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. He wanted all of it. He wanted me erased completely cleanly on paper. He wanted to turn my life into a bank deposit. He underestimated you, Ben, Clara said, stopping her pace. He thought you were just an old man who would fade away in the smoke. The worst part isn't the money, I whispered, the weight of the betrayal finally crushing my chest. It's the fact that he used 45 years of my trust to build this coffin. Every time I signed something without reading it, because my son was there, I was handing him another nail. I was helping him bury me. Clara reached out and placed a hand on mine. It was the first time she had broken her professional exterior. We have the documents now, Ben. He thinks he's safe because he has your signature. He doesn't realize we have his digital footprints and his neighbor's dash cam. He's already caught. He just hasn't felt the handcuffs yet. I nodded, though my heart was still in the ashes of Prospect Avenue. 3 days later, the postman delivered a letter to Leo's house. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, staring at the same chocolate-colored sofa where I'd spent the last week. It was a cream-colored envelope, heavy and expensive. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Julian's, elegant, confident, and utterly fake. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a card and invitation to a family lunch at Julian and Vicky's house in West Hartford. Dad, the family wants to celebrate you. Sunday lunch, 2 o'clock. Everyone will be there. We're so glad you're safe. Love, Julian. I read it twice. I looked at the date, Sunday, January 26th. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel the urge to cry. For the first time since the night everything burned, I felt a cold, sharp clarity. Julian was managing the narrative. He was gathering the witnesses to show everyone how confused and vulnerable his poor father had become. He wanted to play the hero one last time before he moved me into Riverside. I picked up my phone and dialed Clara's number. Clara, I said when she picked up. I just got an invitation to lunch. Julian wants a performance. Don't decline it, Ben, Clara said, her voice turning into polished steel. If he wants a performance, we'll give him one he'll never forget. I'll call Grant. It's time we showed your son that some memories don't burn. Cliffhanger. I hung up the phone and looked at the invitation. I was going to my son's house one last time, but I wasn't going as a victim. I was going as the man who had taught Julian everything he knew about building things, and I was about to show him how quickly they could fall apart. Clara's voice over the phone was steady, but guarded the same tone she used when she needed me to listen with absolute focus. Don't go alone, Mr. Miller. This isn't a celebration. This is Julian controlling the narrative before we can make our move. He's inviting the family to witness your decline, so that when the police arrive, he can claim your accusations are just the ramblings of a confused old man. I sat at Leo's kitchen table, the cream-colored invitation in my hand. It felt heavy like a lead weight. 3 days. That was all the time I had left before I had to walk into the lion's den, a house bought with the spoils of a career I'd helped build, occupied by a son who had tried to turn me into smoke. I know what he's doing, Clara, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. The shock had passed, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. He wants to be the grieving son while I'm still alive. He wants to show everyone how difficult it's been since the fire, how my memory is failing. He's setting the stage for Riverside. Exactly, Clara replied. But we have the counterscript. Grant, tell him where we stand. There was a click as Grant Sterling joined the conference call. Ben, the gears are turning. I spent the morning with the state's attorney and the Federal Insurance Crime Bureau. We've formally filed for an arrest warrant. Between the dash cam footage from Leo's truck, the forensic analysis of the RF device I pulled from your wall, and the digital logs of Vicky practicing your signature, we have a mountain of probable cause. The judge is reviewing the file now. It'll take 48 to 72 hours to get that signature, which means it'll be ready by Sunday, I noted. Timing is everything, Grant said. But we have a logistical problem. If I show up at Julian's house as a private investigator, he'll have me removed for trespassing before I can even step off the porch. We need a way in. We need to be inside when that warrant goes live. This was where the plan took shape. It was a strategy born of Clara's legal sharp-wittedness and Grant's tactical experience. You're going to bring a guest, Ben, Clara said. In the eyes of your relatives, you've lost everything. You're vulnerable. It is perfectly reasonable for a man in your position to have a disaster recovery liaison or a family advocate helping you navigate the insurance and housing mess. Grant will be that man. Julian can't kick out your invited support system without looking like a monster in front of his aunts and cousins. He'll have to play the part of the welcoming host. And the police, I asked. 2 plainclothes officers will be stationed in an unmarked car 2 blocks away, Grant explained. As soon as I get the digital confirmation that the warrant is signed, I'll signal them. We wait for the right moment, Ben. We let him talk. We let him dig the hole. Then we fill it in. Leo was standing by the stove, listening in. He looked at me as I hung up the phone, his face etched with worry. Are you sure about this, Mr. Miller, walking back into that house? After everything, it's a lot for anyone, let alone an old man. I finished for him, a small, grim smile playing on my lips. I looked out the window at the empty lot across the street where my life used to be. The charred remains were covered in a fresh layer of snow, white and deceptive. Julian has been sure about every move he's made for months, Leo. He was sure when he bought that speaker. He was sure when he watched me sign that will. He was sure the fire would finish the job. Now, it's my turn to be sure. The next few days were a blur of quiet preparation. I spent Friday afternoon ironing my best suit, the navy blue wool one Margaret had bought for our 30th wedding anniversary. I hadn't worn it since her funeral. It was a bit loose around the waist now, the stress of the last 2 weeks having carved away what little weight I had, but the shoulders still sat square and firm. As I ran the steam iron over the lapels, I thought about the man who had bought this suit. He was a man who believed in the future. He was a man who thought his greatest legacy would be the successful son he'd raised. I realize now that my legacy wasn't Julian. My legacy was the strength to survive him. Saturday night was the hardest. I sat in Leo's guest nook, the silence of the house amplified by the anticipation of the coming storm. I looked at the small black RF remote Grant had returned to me. Grant had explained when he dropped it off that the piece of evidence that mattered was the RF receiver, the component fused to my wall outlet now logged as Exhibit 1 at the State Police Lab. The remote itself was just a transmitter, photographed, cataloged, and returned, because without the receiver, it was simply a piece of black plastic. I kept it anyway. It was a harmless-looking thing, no bigger than a car key, yet it was the trigger for a nightmare. I tucked it into the inner pocket of my navy suit, a souvenir of the truth. Sunday morning arrived with a bright, mocking sun that did nothing to warm the Hartford air. I stood in front of the mirror in Leo's hallway adjusting my tie. Grant was waiting outside in his nondescript black SUV, dressed in a sharp gray suit that made him look more like a corporate lawyer than a private detective. "Ready, Ben?" he asked as I stepped out onto the porch. "I've been ready since the moment I woke up in that smoke," I replied. The drive to West Hartford was quiet. We passed the familiar landmarks, the insurance towers, the old brick warehouses, the sprawling parks. As we turned onto Julian Street, the houses grew larger, the lawns more manicured, the air of wealth more suffocating. This was the world Julian had traded my life for, a world of hedges and stone gates and secrets. Julian's house was a colonial-style mansion, white and pristine, with 2 expensive SUVs parked in the circular driveway. I saw shadows moving behind the large windows. Family members, cousins I hadn't seen in years, all gathered to witness the tragedy of Benedict Miller. Grant parked the car and turned to me. "Remember, Ben, let him lead. Let him be the hero. Clara is on standby. The moment that warrant is active, I'll get a vibration on my watch. Until then, we're just guests." I took a deep breath, the scent of Margaret's favorite laundry detergent still clinging faintly to the wool of my suit. I felt her presence then, not as a ghost, but as a reminder of what real family looked like. "Let's go," I said. I walked up the stone path, my gait steady, my head held high. I knew that when I walked through those front doors, I was walking into the final act of a play my son had started months ago. But Julian had made one fatal mistake in his script. He had written me as a victim who would stay quiet in the dark. He had forgotten that I was the one who taught him how to build a house, and I knew exactly which pillars to pull down to make the whole thing collapse. Cliffhanger. I reached out and pressed the doorbell. The chimes echoed inside a pleasant melodic sound that masked the violence of the truth. A moment later, the door opened, and there stood Julian, wearing a look of concerned warmth that would have fooled anyone but me. Julian's house looked exactly as I remembered, white vinyl siding, a manicured lawn, even in the dead of a Connecticut winter, and an American flag hanging pristine by the front door. Everything was in its place. My son had always been a master of appearances of that polished suburban veneer people called the American dream. But as I stepped out of the car, I didn't see a home. I saw a tomb built with insurance premiums and systematic betrayals. I adjusted the lapels of my navy blue suit. It was loose around my chest, a constant reminder of the weight I had lost since the fire, but the shoulders remained square. Margaret had bought this suit for me because she said it made me look like a man who could weather any storm. She was right. "Ready, Ben?" Grant Sterling asked quietly as he walked beside me. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase looking every bit the professional disaster liaison. "I've been ready for 72 years, Grant." I replied, my voice a flat line of resolve. The front door swung open before I could reach the bell. Julian stood there, a warm, concerned smile on his face that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. "Dad," he stepped forward and pulled me into a tight embrace. It was too firm, too long, the kind of hug men give when they are either saying goodbye or hiding a weapon. He whispered into my ear low enough that Grant wouldn't hear. "I'm glad you came around. Let me handle everything from here." When he pulled away, he looked at Grant with a flicker of practiced politeness. "And this must be Mr. Sterling. My father mentioned your help. Thank you for bringing him safely." "My pleasure, Mr. Miller," Grant said with a voice like polished flint. "I'm just here to ensure Ben has the support he needs during this transition." We entered the living room. The space was crowded. Uncle Robert, Aunt Diane, several cousins, and a few old family friends. The air smelled of roasted chicken and expensive Chardonnay. Vicky appeared with a silver platter of hors d'oeuvres, her smile as perfect as a magazine ad. But when her eyes met mine, I saw a flash of coldness. It was the look of a predator watching a prey that should have died 2 weeks ago. "Ben, thank God you're okay." Aunt Diane rushed over, taking my hands, her eyes brimming with tears. Julian stepped to the center of the room, clapping his hands softly for attention. "Everyone, if I could have a moment." The room fell silent. Julian stood next to me, placing a hand on my shoulder, the same hand that had likely swapped my batteries, the hand that had practiced my signature. "As you all know, the last 2 weeks have been a nightmare for our family." Julian began, his voice trembling with a rehearsed theatricality. "The fire at Dad's house was a devastating shock. We are grateful he's still here, but..." He paused, letting out a heavy choreographed sigh, looking around the room with a mask of profound sorrow. "But the damage wasn't just in the smoke or the soot. Lately, Dad has been showing signs that have left Vicky and me deeply worried. He's been forgetting appointments, confusing past events, and worst of all," he lowered his voice as if sharing a tragic secret. "He started imagining these strange, dark theories about the fire. He's accused the people who love him most of causing it. The doctors call it trauma-induced paranoia, common in the elderly after a catastrophic loss." I sat in a velvet wingback chair, my hands resting on my knees. I watched Uncle Robert nod in sympathy. I saw Aunt Diane reach for a tissue. They looked at me with pity, the look reserved for a broken clock, a relic that had outlived its usefulness. "He needs professional care." Julian continued, stepping forward to command the room. "We've arranged a place riverside where he'll be cared for 24/7. We're doing this out of love. No matter what he says about us, no matter how much he hates me for taking him there, I will do it because I cannot watch him destroy himself any longer." Vicky stepped up, placing a hand on Julian's shoulder to support her grieving husband. She looked at me, her lips curling into a microscopic, victorious sneer. The entire room turned toward me. The silence was heavy thick with the weight of their judgment. 15 pairs of eyes were waiting for the confused old man to break down to shout, to cry actions that would only prove Julian's point. But I didn't. I looked Julian directly in the eyes. I didn't see my son. I saw a stranger trying to bury his father alive under a pile of paperwork and lies. My silence wasn't confusion. It was observation. I watched his posture, the way he checked his watch, his smugness, and what he thought was a checkmate. My silence began to change the air in the room. From pity, they began to feel uneasy. Why wasn't I reacting? Why were my eyes so sharp, so steady? I felt the weight of the RF remote in my suit pocket. I thought of the will. The printer logs, the dash cam footage. Julian thought he was hosting a celebration of my decline, but he was actually presiding over his own trial. "Dad," Julian asked, his voice cracking just a fraction, "do you have anything you want to say to everyone?" I remained silent. I simply smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made Julian's confidence falter. At that moment, I saw Grant Sterling move in the corner of my eye. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. A faint light reflected off his face. He glanced at the screen, then looked up at me across the room. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The signal was live. The judge in Hartford had signed the warrant. The plainclothes officers were no longer 2 blocks away. I slowly stood up from the chair. My navy suit was crisp, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I didn't feel like a victim. Julian stepped back, his certainty crumbling as he saw the sudden terrifying dignity in the man he'd just declared demented. "What are you doing, Dad?" Julian asked, his voice now laced with genuine fear. I didn't answer him. I looked at Grant, who had already begun moving toward the front door to greet the uninvited guests we had prepared for my son. "Julian," I finally said, my voice clear, resonant, and entirely sane, making every relative in the room gasp. "This lunch is over. There are some people from the Hartford Police Department at your door, and they aren't here for the chicken." Grant Sterling stood up from his chair in the corner of that living room. There was no rush, no dramatic flair, just the quiet, certain movement of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He adjusted his jacket, stepped past Aunt Diane, who was still frozen with a wine glass halfway to her lips, and walked into the center of the plush Persian rug. Julian Miller. Grant's voice wasn't gravelly anymore. It was cold, official, and loud enough to rattle the window panes. He pulled a gold badge from his belt and held a folded document in his other hand. "I am an investigator with the Fire Marshal's office, working in conjunction with the Hartford Police Department. I have here a warrant for your arrest signed by a Superior Court judge on charges including attempted first-degree arson, federal insurance fraud, and elder endangerment." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of a car door closing outside. Julian's face went through a terrifying transformation. The mask of the grieving son didn't just slip, it shattered. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh, looking around at the shocked faces of his relatives. "This is insane. This is a joke, right, Dad? Dad put you up to this. Look at him. He's not well. Anyone can see that. He's confused, he's making things up because he lost his house. You're arresting me based on the stories of a senile old man." "Actually," Grant said, stepping closer to the mahogany coffee table, "we're arresting you based on the stories you told yourself." Grant pulled his smartphone from his pocket and laid it on the table. He tapped the screen. "Your phone was seized as part of the preliminary federal insurance investigation 48 hours ago. You thought you'd wiped your sent folders, Julian. You thought deleting the audio files was enough. But digital footprints don't burn as easily as wooden paper." He hit play. The room filled with a familiar voice. It was Julian's voice, but stripped of the warmth and the concern he'd been faking all afternoon. It was a voicemail sent to Vicky, time-stamped December 22nd, 2024. "Vicky, the timer is set. Sunday the 11th, 11:45. Make sure you're with me at the restaurant that night. We need the receipt for the alibi. Dad won't hear a thing. I took care of the batteries. It's a clean sweep. Once the house is gone, the insurance clears the path. We're finally getting what we're owed." The recording ended with a sharp digital click. The atmosphere in the room didn't just turn cold, it turned lethal. Vicky, who had been standing by the fireplace, let out a strangled gasp. Her hand shook so violently that her crystal wine glass slipped shattering on the hardwood floor with a sound like a gunshot. Julian's face turned a translucent, sickly shade of gray. Julian, Aunt Diane whispered, her voice trembling. What did you do? Julian didn't answer. He didn't look at his aunt. He looked at the front door, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. It's fake, he hissed, though the conviction had vanished from his tone. A deep fake. He's framing me. Save it for the district attorney, Grant interrupted. At that moment, the back door leading to the patio burst open. Two men in plainclothes, heavy coats and badges hanging from their necks, stepped inside, blocking the exit. Vicky had already begun to stumble toward the kitchen, her eyes wild with the instinct to run, but she stopped dead when she saw the officers. Vicky Miller, one of the officers said, "You are being detained as a person of interest in a federal fraud investigation. Don't make this harder than it already is." One of the officers moved toward Julian. He didn't resist, but his body went limp, as if the bones had suddenly turned to water. The officer spun him around, pulling his arms behind his back. Click, click. The sound of the handcuffs was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of 30 years of memories being severed. It was the sound of the truth finally catching up to the lies. Julian was handcuffed right there in his own living room, surrounded by the family he had gathered as an audience for my humiliation. He had wanted them to see a confused old man. Instead, they saw a common criminal in an expensive suit. "The play has ended, Julian," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. Only it didn't end the way you wrote it. The relatives, the cousins who had looked at me with pity, Uncle Robert who had nodded at Julian's lies, all recoiled as the officers led Julian toward the door. The house, which had felt like a fortress of wealth an hour ago, now felt like a crime scene. As they led Julian out past me, he finally looked up. For a brief, agonizing second, our eyes met. I looked for the son I'd raised. I looked for a spark of regret, a plea for forgiveness, even a flash of the little boy who used to help me in the woodshop. I found nothing. His eyes were empty, filled only with the bitter, jagged resentment of a man who had been caught. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. There was no, "I'm sorry," and there was no, "How could you?" There were no words left in the English language that could bridge the canyon between us. He was a stranger who happened to share my DNA. The front door closed behind them, the red and blue lights of the cruisers outside reflecting off the pristine white siding of the house. The relatives began to murmur a low, frantic hum of disbelief and shame, but I didn't stay to listen. I turned toward the hallway and saw Clara Vance appearing at the doorway. She wasn't in her professional suit anymore. She was wearing a heavy trench coat, her face pale in the evening light. She didn't look victorious. She looked grim. "It's done, Ben," Clara said softly, pulling her coat closed against the night air. I looked back one last time, at the room, the shattered wine glass still on the floor, the relatives sitting in stunned silence, the empty chair where my son had performed his final act. Julian had built this house of lies over months, brick by careful brick. It had taken one voicemail to bring it down in an evening. I followed Clara out into the cold. I didn't look back again. The sentencing would come, the paperwork would come. But tonight, for the first time since January 11th, the weight on my chest had lifted just enough for me to breathe. Clara and I sat in her car outside Julian's house for a long time. The world outside the windshield was a chaotic blur of red and blue, the emergency lights of the Hartford police cruisers reflecting off the fresh snow like a rhythmic neon heartbeat. Inside the house, through the large bay windows of the living room, Julian was so proud of, I could hear Aunt Diane crying. It was a high, thin sound that pierced through the glass and the cold night air. The silence inside the car was different. It was heavy, clinical, and smelled of Clara's expensive leather interior. She didn't start the engine. She just sat with her hands on the steering wheel, watching as the officers led Julian, now a silhouette of a man in handcuffs, toward the lead vehicle. "It's a lot to take in at once, Ben," Clara said softly, breaking the silence. "But the arrest is only half the battle. Now we have to make sure he stays behind bars." The voicemail. I said, my voice sounding hollow in the small space. "That was enough, wasn't it?" "It's powerful for the jury," Clara replied, turning to look at me. "But prosecutors want paper. They want the how and the when. And that's what we spent the afternoon finalizing at the state's attorney's office." She reached into the back seat and pulled out a thin blue folder. "We sat down with a notary from that August clinic visit, the associate of Marcus Thorne. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. She was the on-site associate notary that day, working under Marcus Thorne, the senior notary Julian used regularly through his real estate firm. Thorne arranged the appointment. Jenkins was the one who physically watched you sign and then falsely certified that you understood the documents. Once she realized she was facing a 10-year sentence for notary fraud and perjury, she folded like a house of cards. She took a plea deal. She's turned state's evidence. I stared out at the snow. What did she tell you? She confirmed exactly what we suspected, Ben. The document confusion was orchestrated to the second. Julian didn't need to drug you. He didn't need to force your hand. He simply used your trust as a blindfold. Sarah Jenkins admitted that Julian pre-marked the signature lines. He told you they were for insurance, but in reality, they were the signature pages for your last will and testament and a power of attorney that gave him control over your medical and financial decisions the moment you were declared incapacitated. Clara opened the folder, showing me a copy of the notarized document. My signature was there, steady, unsuspecting, a mark of a father who believed in his son. Under Connecticut law, Clara continued, this is a classic case of undue influence. He isolated you in that sterile room, created a false sense of urgency, and misrepresented the nature of the documents. Combined with Sarah's testimony that Julian paid her $15,000 under the table to bypass the legal requirement of reading the document summary to you, it's a slam dunk for the prosecution. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window. How long's Clara? How long had he been planning this? Clara paused, her gaze drifting back to the police cars as they began to pull away, taking my son into the dark. We tracked the bank transfers and the initial drafts on Vicky's home office printer. Based on the digital metadata and the deposit dates for Riverside Care, it's been at least 8 months, Ben. He started building the framework for your disappearance last April. The date hit me like a physical blow. April. 8 months, I whispered. My vision blurred as I looked out at the Hartford streetlights. In April, I spent 3 days in the garage fixing the engine on his old car because he said he didn't have time to take it to a mechanic. I had grease under my fingernails for a week and I was happy to do it. I felt a shudder run through my frame that had nothing to do with the winter chill. Last June, I bought him those expensive golf clubs he wanted for Father's Day. In September, I sent him $500 for his birthday with a note telling him how proud I was of the man he'd become. I was sitting at my kitchen table writing him checks, while he was sitting across from a notary with my forged signature, planning exactly how he'd turn my home into a funeral pyre. I thought of the Christmas dinner we'd had just weeks ago. I had bought a small hand-carved wooden rocking horse for a grandson that Julian and Vicky said they were thinking about having. But I had spent hours in my workshop, the scent of white pine and cedar filling the air, thinking about the future of the Miller family. All the while, Julian was checking the digital timer on a smart outlet, making sure it would spark at 11:47 p.m. He didn't just plan a fire. I said, a cold, sharp anger finally beginning to replace the grief. He planned my ending. Every time he smiled at me, every time he hugged me, he was just checking to see if the nails in my coffin were still tight. Clara said, her voice filled with a grim professional certainty. He planned for your death, and he planned for your silence. The 3-tier plan, insurance, Riverside, and the will. It was a hostile takeover of a human life. She finally turned the key in the ignition. The heater kicked in, blowing warm air that felt like an insult to the coldness in my heart. The trial date will be set within 30 days, Clara said as she put the car in gear and began to pull away from the white mansion in West Hartford. Julian's attorney will try to delay. They'll try to argue that the voicemail was taken out of context or that Sarah Jenkins is an unreliable witness. But Mr. Miller, the evidence is overwhelming. The paper trail is a mile long. This is going to court, and you are going to be heard. I nodded, staring at the empty dashboard. I'll be there, Clara. I'll drop you at Leo's, she said. Try to get some rest, Ben. You've had a longer day than most men have in a lifetime. She was wrong about the rest. When she dropped me off at Leo's apartment, the house was quiet. Leo was already at work, his truck gone from its usual spot. I walked into the small guest nook and sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the navy suit Margaret had bought me. I looked at the dark ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the city outside. I thought about Julian. I thought about the trial. But more than anything, I found myself thinking about a memory I hadn't let myself touch since the night everything burned. There was a version of Julian I kept returning to. Not the man in handcuffs, not the voice on the sidewalk. An earlier version, one I was no longer sure had ever been real. I closed my eyes, but sleep was miles away. The fire had burned my house, and the law had taken my son. But as I sat in the silence of Leo's house, I realized there was one more thing the fire hadn't revealed yet. Something I'd been avoiding, something buried deeper than the insurance papers and the fake wills. Cliffhanger. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small black RF remote. I stared at it in the moonlight. I wasn't thinking about Julian anymore. I was thinking about the last thing Margaret had said to me before she passed. She'd tried to tell me something about Julian, something about a coldness she saw in him even then. I had silenced her with a kiss, telling her she was just worrying too much. I had been wrong, and as I sat there in the dark, I understood that some answers don't come from investigation. They come from being still long enough to hear what you already knew. I sat at Leo's kitchen table at 2 a.m, the night before the trial, with a cup of cold coffee and a question I had been avoiding since the night of the fire. Where did I go wrong? The house was silent save for the low rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the Hartford streets were slick with the last of the winter's rain, reflecting the amber street lamps like liquid gold. I hadn't turned on the lights. I didn't need them. The darkness felt appropriate. It was a space where memories could breathe without being blinded by the present. I looked at my hands. They were calloused, scarred by decades of working with oak, maple, and pine. I had spent my life building things that were meant to last: tables that would hold family dinners, chairs that would support tired backs, a home that was supposed to be a fortress. But as I sat there, I realized you could build a house out of the strongest timber in Connecticut and still watch it collapse if the rot started from the heartwood. My mind drifted back 35 years. I saw a 7-year-old Julian, his hair dusty with sawdust, climbing onto a stool in my garage. He used to watch me for hours, his small fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "Dad, why does the wood smell so sweet?" he had asked once, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's the sap, Julian," I'd told him. "It's the life of the tree even after it's gone. If you treat the wood with respect, it'll tell you its story." I had thought I was teaching him craft. I thought I was teaching him character. But looking back through the cold lens of the evidence Clara had shown me, I wondered if he had ever cared about the wood at all. Maybe he was just studying the tools, learning how to take things apart instead of how to put them together. Then came the memory of Margaret. She had been the steady hand to my restless one. I remembered a summer evening in 2005. Julian was in college, then already obsessed with market trends and leveraging assets. He had been cold to a neighbor who came over to ask for help with a broken fence. After he left, Margaret had looked at me, her brow furrowed in a way that usually meant she saw something I was missing. "Ben," she had said, her voice quiet but firm. "That boy has your hands, but he doesn't have your heart. He looks at people like they're just more lumber to be stacked. Watch him, Ben. Please." I had laughed it off. I'd kissed her forehead and told her she was worrying over nothing, that he was just ambitious. I didn't want to believe that the boy I'd raised could be hollow inside. I had chosen to be blind, and tonight in the silence of Leo's kitchen, the weight of that choice felt heavier than the house I'd lost. A soft floorboard creaked behind me. I didn't turn around. Leo walked in, rubbing his eyes, wearing a faded t-shirt. He didn't ask why I was sitting in the dark. He just walked to the sink, filled a glass of water, and then pulled out the chair opposite me. He sat down, the simple presence of another human soul, offering a comfort that words couldn't reach. "You know what the worst part is? Leo." I asked, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet. I keep trying to find the moment I failed him, the day I should have been firmer, or the conversation I should have stayed for. I keep looking for the crack I missed. Leo stayed silent for a moment, staring into his glass. Then he shook his head slowly. "Mr. Miller, I've spent my life delivering packages across this state. I've seen $1,000 vases packed in bubble wrap that arrived shattered, and I've seen cheap glass thrown in a cardboard box that didn't have a scratch. Some things are just made a certain way." He looked up at me, his gaze steady. "Some people choose who they are, sir. Julian had 30 years of your example. He had the wood shop, he had your wife, and he had a home that was paid for with honest work. If he chose to burn it all for a check, that's not a failure of yours to own. That's a choice he made in the dark." I looked down at the table. Between us lay the small black RF, remote, the one Grant had returned to me as non-essential evidence, once they'd photographed it. It had been sitting there since the day I moved in. It was the thing that had started the fire, the physical manifestation of my son's betrayal. I picked it up. It felt light, insignificant. A cheap piece of plastic that had been designed to end my life. I stared at it for a long time, remembering how Julian had handed it to me with a smile. Then I leaned over and opened the small junk drawer in Leo's kitchen. I set the remote inside next to a pile of old batteries and tangled string and pushed the drawer shut. "I don't need it anymore," I whispered. It did what it was supposed to do. It made me hold on long enough to find the truth. I looked up at the small shelf Leo had cleared for me. On it sat a single silver-framed photograph, the one I had kept in my wallet, the only image of Margaret that hadn't melted into the soot of Prospect Avenue. She was laughing, her hair caught in a breeze I could no longer feel. "Margaret," I said softly, my heart finally breaking and mending at the same time. "I should have listened to you. You saw the rot before I did." "She'd be proud of you today, Mr. Miller," Leo said, standing up, "for not letting the fire have the last word." "Thank you, Leo, for everything." He nodded and walked back to his room, leaving me alone with my cold coffee and my cleared conscience. At 7 the next morning, the sun broke over Hartford with a sharp, piercing clarity. I stood in front of the small mirror in Leo's hallway and put on the navy blue vest, the one Margaret had chosen for our 30th anniversary. I smoothed the wool, adjusted my tie, and checked my reflection. I didn't see an old man who had lost his home. I didn't see a victim who had been discarded by his only son. I saw a man who was still standing, a man who knew the difference between a house and a home, and between a lie and the truth. I walked out of the apartment and toward the Hartford Superior Court. The air was cold, but it felt clean. I wasn't going there to beg for justice or to weep for what was lost. I was walking into that courtroom as the final architect of this story. I was walking in as a witness to the truth, and I knew that while Julian had the paperwork, I had the wood, and the wood never lied. Cliffhanger. As I reached the courthouse steps, I saw Clara Vance waiting for me. She looked at my blue vest and gave me a small, solemn nod. But as we turned to enter, she leaned in and whispered, "The defense just filed a last-minute motion, Ben. They're calling a witness we didn't expect. Someone Julian says can prove he was never at your house that night." Courtroom C of Hartford. Superior Court smelled like polished wood and recycled air. It was a cold, institutional scent that seemed to strip away the humanity of everyone inside. I took my seat in the third row, adjusting the sleeves of the navy blue vest Margaret had chosen for me so many years ago. I looked straight ahead, my gaze fixed on the judge's bench. Julian was already there. He was no longer the man in the $3,000 suit who moved through West Hartford with the grace of a king. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed to a chain around his waist. His head was bowed, his eyes fixed on the mahogany table in front of him. He never once looked back at the gallery. He never once looked at me. The trial lasted 4 days, but for me, it felt like a lifetime, distilled into a few hundred pages of transcript. When it was my turn to take the stand, the room went silent. I walked to the witness box, my gait steady, my back straight. I swore the oath with a clear, resonant voice. For 3 hours, I told the story from the warmth of the wood shop to the acrid taste of the smoke, from the silence of my dead hearing aid to the chill of the hospital bed, where I realized my son had tried to bury me. I spoke about the clinic in August, the papers Julian had pushed toward me, and the water that made me sleepy. I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I was no longer a victim. I was a witness to a crime that had been written in my own blood. Before the prosecution called its first witness, Julian's defense attorney rose with emotion. He introduced a man named Derek Paulson, a colleague of Julian's from his real estate firm, who testified that Julian had been with him at a bar in Glastonbury from 10 o'clock until well past midnight on the night of January 11th. The room shifted. I sat very still. Clara did not flinch. She cross-examined Paulson for 35 minutes. She produced cell tower records showing Julian's phone had pinged a tower within 600 feet of Prospect Avenue at 11:43 p.m., 4 minutes before the RF device triggered. She then produced Julian's own credit card records showing a single transaction at the Glastonbury bar at 9:58 p.m., one transaction for 2 drinks time-stamped before 10 o'clock. Nothing after that. The judge asked Paulson to explain the discrepancy. He could not. The defense withdrew the witness before noon. Then came the experts. Grant Sterling took the stand with the clinical precision of a surgeon. He displayed the remnants of the RF smart outlet, the digital timer, fused into the charred plastic of the speaker. He showed the jury the voltage reports on my hearing aid batteries, proof that they had been deliberately drained. The fire didn't start by accident. Grant testified, his voice echoing in the rafters. It was a timed execution. The defendant didn't just set a fire, he set a trap. Clara Vance coordinated the paper trail with the ferocity of a hawk. She presented the printer logs from Julian's home office, the 23 versions of my signature that Vicky had practiced night after night. She brought in the forensic document examiner, who pointed out the hesitation marks on the $500,000 insurance policy. But the final blow came from the defense table itself. Vicky Miller, dressed in a muted gray suit, took the stand as a witness for the state. She had accepted a plea bargain 3 weeks prior, trading her testimony for a reduced sentence. She didn't look at Julian as she spoke. She described the nights they spent at the kitchen table, the way Julian had calculated the insurance payout versus the cost of the Riverside Care Facility. She confirmed the voicemail, the plan for the alibi at the restaurant, and the $15,000 paid to the notary. Julian said it was for our future. She whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own betrayal. He said the old man was already halfway gone anyway. Julian didn't flinch. He sat like a statue, a hollow shell of the man I thought I'd raised. On the final afternoon, Judge Harrison looked down at the bench, then at the defendant. The jury had returned after only 4 hours of deliberation. The verdict was unanimous. Julian Miller. The judge began, his voice dropping into a deep, somber register. You have been found guilty of attempted murder in the first degree arson, federal insurance fraud, elder abuse forgery, and conspiracy to procure a false notarization. This court has seen many crimes born of desperation, but rarely have we seen a betrayal so calculated, so cold, and so complete. You didn't just attempt to murder your own father for financial gain. You attempted to destroy his very credibility when he dared to survive. The voicemail recovered from the defendant's own device, in which he stated that his father won't hear a thing because he had personally ensured the failure of the victim's hearing aids, established premeditated intent to kill, not merely intent to destroy property. That distinction, this court finds, is not a close call. The judge leaned forward, his eyes burning with a quiet judicial fury. For your crimes against the state, the federal government, and the most sacred bond of family, I sentence you to 25 years in the Connecticut State Penitentiary. Under the statutes governing this offense, you will be required to serve no less than 85% of that sentence before any review of release eligibility may be considered. You will serve every day of that time, reflecting on the value of the life you tried to discard. Vicky was sentenced to 4 years in a minimum security facility and was permanently barred from working in any financial institution or holding any position of fiduciary responsibility. The notary, Sarah Jenkins, received 18 months of probation and the permanent loss of her commission. As the sentence was read, a low murmur broke out among our relatives in the gallery. Aunt Diane was sobbing quietly into a handkerchief. Uncle Robert just stared at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. They had been Julian's audience, the people he'd tried to convince of my dementia. And now they were witnesses to his ruin. Julian still didn't look at me, not when the handcuffs were tightened, not when the bailiff stood him up to lead him away. As they moved him through the aisle, he passed within 3 feet of where I was sitting. I felt the air move as he walked by. For a split second, I expected him to stop. I expected a flare of anger, a plea for mercy, or even a curse. I expected him to finally acknowledge the father he'd tried to kill. He never looked up. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his shoulders hunched in the orange jumpsuit, until the heavy steel doors at the back of the courtroom closed behind him with a definitive echoing thud. And in that silence, I realized something profound. I wasn't waiting for him to look at me. I wasn't waiting for an apology, and I wasn't waiting for the son I'd lost to come back. Somewhere between that snowy curb on Prospect Avenue and this mahogany-lined courtroom, I had stopped needing anything from Julian Miller. I didn't need his love. I didn't need his regret. And I certainly didn't need his permission to exist. I looked at the empty chair where he had sat. The weight that had been crushing my chest for months, the guilt of where did I go wrong, simply vanished. It was gone, burned away by the very truth I'd fought to reveal. I stood up, smoothed my navy vest, and walked toward the exit. Clara was waiting for me at the doors, a look of quiet triumph on her face. "It's over, Ben," she said softly. "No, Clara," I replied, looking out through the glass doors at the bright, cold Hartford sun. "The trial is over, but for the first time in a long time, I think I'm just getting started." Cliffhanger. I stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The air felt incredibly light, as if a layer of soot had been washed off my soul. I watched the police van driving Julian away, and I realized I didn't feel a shred of hatred. I felt nothing at all. But as I reached for my car keys, I saw a familiar face waiting by the fountain, Leo holding a small wooden box I recognized from my old garage. The insurance settlement cleared on April 3rd, 2025, 142 days after the fire. $500,000 less legal fees sitting in a high-yield savings account under my name alone. I stared at the confirmation letter on Leo's kitchen table for a long time without touching it. The numbers didn't feel like freedom. They felt like a receipt for something that should never have been for sale. The legal cleanup had moved quickly once the verdict came in. With Julian's conviction on the books, the Hartford probate court formally vacated the forged will within 2 weeks. My original 1998 will was reinstated, the $200,000 life insurance policy Margaret had set up before she passed the one Julian had quietly folded into his inheritance plan, was placed back under my name, and my name alone. Every document Julian and Vicky had spent months constructing was unwound piece by piece until the paper fortress they had built around my life had nothing left to stand on. I wasn't celebrating. I was just breathing. April in Hartford arrives like a man who isn't sure he's welcome, hesitant gray at the edges. The snow retreating into slush before giving way to the first thin shoots of green pushing up through the frozen mud. It was during those early April mornings that the relatives started appearing at Leo's door. One by one, the people who had sat in Julian's living room and nodded along to his performance came to find me. Aunt Diane was first. She didn't bring anything. She just sat down across from me at Leo's small kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, and looked at me the way people look at someone they've wronged when they finally run out of ways to avoid it. I chose to believe him, she said quietly, because believing you meant believing something I wasn't ready to face about that boy. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said it plainly, and I respected that more than any apology she could have rehearsed. I told her the truth. I wasn't angry. Anger requires a kind of energy I no longer had to spare. The fire had burned through most of it. Clara Vance came by later that same week. She looked different outside of a courtroom. The sharpness was still there in her eyes, but the weight of the trial had lifted from her shoulders. We sat on Leo's front porch with 2 cups of coffee watching the neighborhood come back to life in the pale spring sun. "You have real capital now, Ben," she said. "More than you need for a fresh start. I've been thinking about what to do with the rest of it." She set a folder on the porch railing between us. Inside was a proposal clean detailed, already half-drafted. The Benedict Miller Foundation, a non-profit legal fund for elder financial abuse cases in Connecticut, providing investigators, forensic accountants, and attorneys to people who were being quietly dismantled by the people closest to them. I didn't need to read past the first page. I thought about that sidewalk on January 11th. The cold, the sound of my own house burning, the phone ringing 6 times before my son answered, and what he said when he did. "Do it," I said. "If one person doesn't have to stand on a snowy curb alone, wondering why their family didn't come, then every dollar of that money is exactly where it belongs." Leo had already found me a place to live. A small craftsman-style rental 3 blocks from his house, single-story wide front porch, and a detached 2-car garage with good north-facing light and enough wall space for a proper workbench. The morning I walked into that garage for the first time, I stood in the center of the empty floor and just breathed. It smelled of old motor oil and cool concrete. It smelled like potential. I bought a solid oak workbench and a set of hand planes. Nothing digital, nothing high fidelity, just wood and tools and the quiet work of making something real. By Friday evening, I had the shop arranged the way I wanted it. Leo had saved 1 small wooden box from the ruins of Prospect Avenue, a few tools, some hardware, and the silver frame photograph I had carried in my wallet since the night of the fire. I bought a new frame from a woodworking shop on Farmington Avenue, simple cherry wood, and set Margaret's photograph inside it. The image was scorched at one corner, and the silver had bubbled in the heat, but her laugh was still there. Still exactly as I remembered it. I placed the frame on the windowsill, where the afternoon light would find it every day. Leo appeared in the garage doorway just as the sun was going down. "The grill's hot," he said. "Sarah made chicken skewers. Maya's been asking about the woodman since noon." I wiped the sawdust from my hands, took one last look at Margaret's photograph in its new frame, and turned off the light. Outside, a child was laughing. I followed the sound home. It is July now. Hartford in the summer is nothing like January. The air is warm and thick with the scent of mown grass and blooming hydrangeas. and the days stretch long past 8 in the evening before the light finally gives up. From the window of my workshop, I can see Leo's daughter Maya drawing chalk circles on the sidewalk in neon pink and yellow. She is 7 years old and completely certain that the world is a good place. I find I cannot argue with her. I was at my workbench when Leo knocked finishing the legs on a small cherry wood chair I had been building for Maya's birthday. No power tools, just the steady shick of a hand plane and the thin curl of wood coming off clean with each pass. The smell of fresh cut cherry is one of the best things I know. Sweet and faintly tart like something alive. It reminded me why I started doing this work 50 years ago, back when my hands were steadier and my reasons were simpler. The shop is smaller than my old garage on Prospect Avenue. But every tool is where I put it, every chisel sharpened by my own hand, and the north-facing window throws clean even light across the bench all afternoon. It is enough. It is more than enough. Clara had called earlier that morning with an update on the Benedict Miller Foundation. 3 months, operational, 9 cases already active across Connecticut, 9 people whose families had been quietly dismantling their lives from the inside, 9 people who now had an attorney, an investigator, and someone willing to sit across a table and take them seriously. The state's attorney's office had reached out about drafting new notary oversight legislation based on the evidence patterns our cases had surfaced. "You're changing the law," Ben Clara had said. I had thought about that for a while after we hung up. I didn't set out to change anything. I set out to survive. But if the fire that took my house can keep 9 other houses standing, then something in the arithmetic of it feels right. Not fair. I will never call it fair, but right. Before I got back to the chair, I pulled open the small junk drawer at the corner of the workbench. It held the usual things a tangle of twine spare, screws a pencil worn down to nothing, and 2 other items I had chosen not to throw away. The first was the small black RF remote, Julian's device, the trigger he had left on my coffee table like a gift, certain I would never understand what it was. I had carried it through the fire, through Leo's spare room, through the investigation and the trial, and eventually into this drawer. I looked at it the way you look at an old scar, not with pain exactly, but with the memory of pain, which is a different thing. The second was a small stack of envelopes. 4 of them stamped with the return address of Cheshire Correctional Institution. Julian's handwriting on each one, that familiar, confident script that used to make me proud when I saw it on birthday cards. I had read each letter once. He writes about the cold of the cell. He writes about wanting a visit. He does not write about the fire or the batteries or the forged will or the nursing home deposit or any of the machinery he had built to erase me. He writes only about himself and what he needs. I folded the most recent letter, placed it back in the drawer, and closed it. Someday, maybe. But not today. The knock came at the garage door frame just as I was setting down my plane. Leo, still in his work clothes, leaning against the wood with the particular ease of a man who has earned his tiredness honestly. "Grill's hot," he said. "Sarah made the chicken skewers. Maya has been asking for the woodman since 2 o'clock. I washed my hands at the back sink and caught my reflection in the small mirror above it. Older, yes. The lines around my eyes have deepened and my hair has gone fully silver since January, but the eyes are clear. The face is the face of a man who knows what he survived and does not need to perform anything for anyone. I stepped out into the evening. The neighborhood was warm and loud with summer, a lawnmower somewhere down the block, crickets starting up in the hedges, the sound of a ball bouncing in a backyard. Sarah had spread a yellow cloth on the outdoor table. Maya was on the sidewalk, both hands pink, with chalk dust standing next to an enormous heart she had drawn in front of my driveway. "It's for the new house," she announced. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at the open garage, the lit workbench, the cherry wood chair waiting to be finished, and Margaret's photograph in its new frame on the windowsill. I sat down at the table among people who had chosen to show up. That is the whole of it. That is everything. The fire consumed my house, but it ultimately illuminated the harshest truth. Looking back at this journey, I realized that the tragedy of family betrayal did not begin with a spark, but with my own blindness. God gave us eyes to see, yet I chose to keep mine closed because I trusted blood too much. My advice to you, don't be like me. Never let your compassion become a loophole for malice. A beautiful family story is not just built with bricks. It must be reinforced with vigilance. When facing family betrayal, kindness without defense is merely a slow form of suicide. I understand that a painful family story like this serves as a costly lesson on faith. Love deeply but never stop observing, for sometimes the hand holding the knife is the one you cherish most. Do not let family betrayal destroy your life because of simple naivety. I hope my family story helps you protect yourself. Please leave a comment with your thoughts, share this post, and subscribe to spread these valuable life lessons. Thank you for following until the very end. Warning: the following stories contain fictional elements constructed for educational purposes. If you find this content unsuitable, please feel free to explore other topics.